I'd like to start out by picking up on your last point about moving from here into the G20 summit just a week from now, and the need to strengthen confidence and to encourage all our populations and markets to move in the constructive direction. I suppose if there's a potential threat to success in those regards next week, it might be viewed as differences between Europe and the United States. At a minimum, differences of emphasis as to what the priorities should be, but perhaps even deeper than that, and there have been some sharp words thrown across the Atlantic from the European direction toward the U.S. just in the last 24 hours. Australia has very close ties with both the U.S. and Europe. You've been here for several days. You've been in touch, I know, closely with European leaders. What's your assessment? How serious is the potential difference between the two sides of the Atlantic? How can it best be resolved to achieve the goals that you've enunciated?
Thank you. Thanks, Fred, for the question. I think part of it referred to some extraordinary remarks by the Czech Prime Minister yesterday. I suppose if you just lost a vote of confidence in the Czech Parliament, maybe that doesn't improve your sense of humour. But going to the substance of the observation, I think there is always a tendency to exaggerate disagreement over the fundamentals of agreement. And there's always a tendency to see the glass as being part empty rather than primarily full. And when I look at the ingredients of what emerges as a possible agreement in London, let's look at those building blocks on stimulus, on repairing bank assets and restoring banks to health, the future of the IMF and its resourcing and reform, future regulatory shape, and look at protectionism. What I sense across most of my counterparts across the G20 is a strong sense of emerging consensus on most of those questions. There's always going to be, and let me use a technical Australian term for you, argy-bargy. It's short for argument. There's always going to be some, well, it's always important to add to your lexicon when you have visiting Australian politicians. So the new word for the day is argy-bargy. There's always going to be some argument or argy-bargy about things at the margin. But let us remind ourselves, for example, on what has been agreed by way of coordinated stimulus so far. It's significant. It's huge. As the IMF says, by the calculation, were it not to have been done in the course of the last several months, you'd have nearly 20 million people more who would be unemployed. This is significant and unprecedented, coordinated macroeconomic action across the world's largest economies. We've not seen anything like this before. It's significant and it's important. The second thing I'd say is to emphasise the fact that for the first time you have this very large gathering. 20 nations representing something like 90% of global GDP, drawn from every continent, developed economies and developing economies, and working together on a common program of action. That hasn't happened before either. It's either been the G7 and a few people over there on the side maybe. This is also unprecedented. So what I sense across my counterparts in the G20 is an overwhelming sense of the seriousness of the challenge. I sense a high degree of emerging consensus on these core challenges, and hold the phone if a few people have a bit of a disagreement about some of the details of parts of it. That's normal. That's what happens. But I would suggest that it's really important to focus on the overwhelming agreement which has been reached thus far, reflected in what the G20 finance ministers produced by way of their communiqué 10 days ago, and the overwhelming sense of common challenge represented by the action which has already been taken. All unprecedented, and of a scale and order of magnitude we haven't seen before, and commensurate with the dimensions of the global challenge we face. So on balance, it's going to be tough, there'll still be disagreements, but I think we should not be distracted by what I would describe as disagreements at the margins.
Floor is open for questions and comments. Stanley, let me ask each questioner to identify herself or himself, indicate where you're from, and fire away.
Stanley Roth, the Boeing Company. Welcome back to Washington, Mr. Prime Minister. As ever, I'd like to follow Fred's lead and keep the focus on the G20 meeting. You've clearly laid out the opportunities that the G20 represents, why it's the right institution as opposed to some of the other mechanisms. But I'd like you to focus a little bit on the risks, which Fred was hinting at, and I'm thinking particularly on the trade/protectionist side. A lot of attention has been given to the fact that after the last meeting and the very bold call for countries to avoid protectionist action, 17 of 20 took some form of protectionist action of varying degrees of significance. Is it your sense that there has been a change in recognition of the severity of the problem, that needs to do better, that this falls in the area that you would say there's a common recognition of not only the problem but the solution, or do you think this is an area that might get bogged down as opposed to economic reform of financial institutions or stimulus?
I think on the protectionism front, what I detect again across G20 leaders is an overwhelming desire and political will not to slide back. I think periodic reports of the type you've just described in the great global business of public naming and shaming is a good thing to do, because it then acts as a corrective within national cabinets as to whether an action being contemplated as part of a domestic stimulus package actually has an inherent protectionist dimension, explicit or implicit. I think the challenge going forward is to commission regular such reports back to the G20, and at a frequency which is meaningful. Not a report every year or two, but I'm talking about a report every 3 or 6 months. I think that's important. Also to commit afresh for a further 12-month period to avoid any further protectionist measures. I think that is also an important step forward. On the path to long-term, moving from, if you like, the defensive to the offensive, which is what you do with the future of Doha, it's important also for governments of the world, in the midst of these challenges, not to lose sight of the great Doha opportunities. They're tough, they're hard, but any of you have been in a trade negotiation that's not. I think the challenge is to keep Doha alive, and as the opportunity presents itself during the course of 2009, to progress those negotiations towards conclusion. I think if you have those ingredients, that is avoiding through explicit and public global reporting on any violations of existing arrangements or violations by way of further protectionist measures, and underline the commitment to resume Doha as the year unfolds, I think you've got a reasonable basis to proceed with confidence. Just one footnote, Stanley, is I referred before to financial protectionism. And what I am concerned about globally is unless we deal with this problem of impaired assets on the globally significant banks' balance sheets, then you will see, and we already see evidence of it, of capital being repatriated to a home base. And that actually creates huge problems of growth and development around the world. So I go back to what I said in my formal remarks. The central economic problem today is dealing with impaired assets on the balance sheets of the world's most significant banks. This is causal. Everything else we're dealing with is actually dealing with the effects, necessarily so, but this is causal. And that's why, underreported though I think it was, the agreement reached in the G20 finance ministers meeting just 10 days ago on, for the first time, an agreed international framework for toxic asset management is actually substantively an important step forward. National actions have to accompany it. That's why I welcome so warmly the recent decision and statement by Secretary Geithner about what the United States will be doing going forward itself.
Richard.
Thank you. Richard Feinberg, University of California, San Diego. Mr. Prime Minister, the developing countries have fought long and hard to make their way into the governing structure, and now they are part of the G20, as you emphasized. Many of the measures the G20 will probably adopt are long-standing demands, really, of many of the developing countries. But now that the developing countries are part of the governing structure, what do you see as their obligations? What do they need to do to contribute to the G20 conclusions and the success of that meeting?
This is an excellent question. To paraphrase a paradigm used by Bob Zoellick some time ago about China becoming a responsible global stakeholder around the global negotiating table, in this case on economic questions through the G20. So it applies more broadly to any of us joining that negotiating table, any and all of us from whichever country is developed or developing. I think the core part of my answer to your question goes as a supplement to my answer to Stanley Roth just before, which is if you look at the composition of developing economies around the table at the G20, a lot of those governments hold within their hands also a capacity to see Doha to a successful conclusion. And therefore, that is of great interest to all of us and great interest to them as well. Secondly, on the question of IMF reform, which I referred to before, remember when the IMF was created, the great meeting at Bretton Woods in 1944. The world has changed a lot, and the relative proportion of global GDP now coming out of the emerging economies is much, much greater. It's time for the IMF to accommodate within its voting structures that new reality. That will have consequences for many of our friends in Europe in particular. But I think it's time we all globally bit that bullet. But it also requires that those stepping up to the plate from the developing countries and the emerging economies make their resources available and become, therefore, co-participants in dealing with emerging external balance problems across the world, as well as systemic problems in banking systems around the world. And I'm optimistic that that sense of responsibility and part of the new participants is there. I think one of the great leaders coming through this process is my good friend Lula from Brazil. I think he's doing a great job. And I think Brazil's leadership on open trade, participation effectively in global governance questions, including IMF reform, the continuation of the G20 itself, as reflected in a statement I think President Lula made overnight, underlines the positive contribution which can come from these new large members of the global governing family.
I can't resist following up on two aspects of your answer to that question. One, about the responsibilities of the key emerging markets, in this case China, to take a major responsibility for the international economic system, and also your comment about the need to strengthen the role of the IMF. The governor of the People's Bank of China has just made some sweeping proposals for alterations in the global monetary system. It's been characterized in the media as reducing the role of the dollar, but when you read his paper, it really has a lot to do with building the role of the IMF and multilateralizing the global economic order. What's your take on the substance of that, and should it become an item on the G20 long-term reform agenda?
Firstly, to use the excuse of all politicians, I haven't read the full text of Governor Zhou's statement. So there is a very big caveat for you all. And it's obviously seriously considered and worthy of a serious reflection. I've just seen some newspaper reports of parts of it. Firstly, on the question of the whole question of reserve currency, I said this in a forum, I think, with the Wall Street Journal a few days ago. I mean, my view is very straightforward. The US dollar remains the world's reserve currency, and it's an important and essential stabilising part of the global financial and economic future. On the broader questions of China's role within the IMF, obviously, if you look at some of the financing resource problems that I referred to in my formal remarks, and just the dimensions of some of the challenges emerging in the developing economies off the back of this crisis, we're going to need China to be upfront with a much greater investment. The Chinese will say that's all well and good, but we also want bigger voting shares than Belgium and the Netherlands, which is what we've currently got. And therein lies the essence of the discussion. Presently, as you know, leaders have agreed to bring forward the negotiation on readjustment of quotas and voting rights to January 2011. I think it's going to be important for leaders meeting in London and at a subsequent G20 summit to work out the principles not just in relation to China, but more broadly for those who are newly coming on board into greater roles and responsibilities as far as the IMF's concerned.
Morris Goldstein, Peterson Institute. Mr. Prime Minister, you've given us a thorough review of the main policy areas for the upcoming London G20 summit, and you put a lot of emphasis on fighting protectionism. You've singled out trade policy, financial protectionism. You haven't said anything about exchange rates. Undervalued exchange rates, talking down exchange rates can be a potential source of beggar thy neighbor policies as well. Is there some kind of agreement we also need on that kind of policy during the London summit?
You raise, of course, a very important question. I think in a wider remit, and let's call it the topic of financial protectionism, it then obviously merges into any possibilities concerning exchange rate manipulation, which is the core of your question. I think, and here I don't speak with any authority in terms of any documents which are currently before us for the G20, but in terms of what constitutes, I think, an important area of longer-term reform, and it's parallel to what I said before about periodic reporting mechanisms on overt and covert protectionist measures by individual states, is that periodic reporting on any, shall I say it, inexplicable exchange rate movement, other than through normal market mechanisms, would also form a useful correction or corrective device in the overall fabric of global economic governance. You'd appreciate this is a highly sensitive area, and it is for all governments, all economies, and therefore all currencies. I think, however, some open, transparent reporting mechanism on what's happening with particular exchange rate movements over time, if there is any agreed evidence that certain movements may have been manipulated, would be a useful addition to the global debate and also a useful potential corrective for the future as well.
Other questions and comments? Yes.
Mary Shirley from the Ronald Coase Institute. Do you also support the proposition in your call for changes at the IMF that IMF conditionality, stringent conditionality that is normally attached to its funds should be reduced or even eliminated? And how do we guard then against the risk of pouring lots of money into institutionally weak and sometimes very corrupt countries?
Well, there's the dilemma of the ages. and if you could leave me the mathematical formula for that at the door, then we'd all be a lot better off. This is a tough one, but let's sort of go to its core, which is the impact which the decisions after the Asian financial crisis in particular had on the IMF's perceived credibility in many of those significant economies in East Asia. The one that I'm most familiar with, of course, is Indonesia, our neighbour, and what happened in the events post-97-98 there. I think in looking to the future, it's important for us all, for the IMF's credibility in the eyes of developing countries and developing economies to be restored. Let us not get into the blame apportionment game. Let's just park that to one side. Let us look, however, at the important and central question of ensuring that when you're looking at either an external financing problem or a systemically significant banking problem within one of the major economies of East Asia or beyond, that we overcome this threshold problem that the having assistance from the IMF, either at a technical or a substantive level, means that you're in absolute terminal trouble. That's part of the perceived problem. The second, of course, goes to the heart of your question about explicit conditionalities. What I would be recommending for further work within the IMF is a range of instruments which would therefore reflect a range of conditionalities. And depending on the actual nature of the problem and any agreed analytical consensus on the causality of the problem, The problem, as articulated by some of our friends in East Asia, for example, is that some of the conditionalities opposed in the late 90s had little to do with the cause of the specific problems they were seeking to address. And it was seen as a window of opportunity by some in the IMF to actually impose an entirely different, what they would argue was not just a financial management regime, but a new setting in politics within those countries as well. So I think a range of instruments, each with some flexibility attached, a more flexible range of instruments, let me put it this way, with a range of conditionalities from hard down the spectrum, depending on the agreed analysis of the problem that is being addressed. I just conclude with this. Why do we need to fix this problem? If we, in the year or two ahead, have significant external account problems emerging in a range of economies in the developing world, and let's hope that that does not occur, but if they do, we need to have arrived at a position where the IMF is seen to be a neutral, technical and effective intervention agent in order to assist not just the interests of global economic stability, but also in rectifying balance within the country and economy concerned. Absent that, and an unwillingness to use the IMF or an unpreparedness on the IMF to intervene, I think we're in a whole lot more trouble than would otherwise be the case.
Clayton Heider, Mr. Prime Minister, formerly USTR and formerly U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. We've been focusing a lot today on avoiding backsliding in international trade policy, which is probably the appropriate focus at the moment. But we shouldn't forget the need to find a way to move trade liberalization forward in the future, in the long run. The one aspect of that on which we've not had any discussion today is bilateral and plurilateral free trade agreements. In particular, APEC. Would you like to give your assessment either generally or specifically with respect to APEC?
Thank you for that question, Clayton, and I acknowledge your strong contribution to working with us in common fields of endeavour over many, many years, both as USTR and relatedly with that as Secretary of Agriculture. On the range of the proposal by the previous Bush administration for effectively a free trade area across the APEC area, free trade for Asia and the Pacific. We, as the Australian government, have been supportive of that. The technical challenge lies in how you actually fashion the bowl of spaghetti which currently presents itself as this extraordinary array of bilateral and plurilateral FTAs into something which is not of itself perverse for businesses. We in Australia now have a range of FTAs. Obviously with the United States we have them underway in terms of negotiation with both China and Japan. And recently, through the good offices of the Trade Minister Simon Crean, we concluded one with ASEAN. But the challenge is, I believe, an important technical one and then a political one about how the plethora of bilateral and plurilateral FTAs are woven into a seamless whole, and how that, secondly, then becomes a further building block into what we all want, which is comprehensive, multilateral, seriously multilateral trade liberalisation, which lifts all boats. On the progressing of that, at a technical level, I know there's work within APEC on it, and it's important work. We need, however, I believe, to elevate it for political consideration in the unfolding APEC series of meetings, and we in Australia would be supportive of that technical work.
In congressional parlance, could I ask you to extend your remarks on that just slightly? You talked you talked in your remarks about the coming changes in the global financial architecture. You also made a celebrated speech several months ago about the architecture of the Asia-Pacific region and had an envoy, I know, visiting most of the countries in the region a month or so ago. We had the pleasure of talking with him here. Could you give us a preview of how your thinking on that architectural issue is evolving and where it might come out? and particularly how it relates to the existing APEC and the notions for expanding APEC that you just mentioned.
Good. Thanks again, Fred, for the question. We've proposed in Australia, not long after I became Prime Minister, that we set for ourselves a goal of building an Asia-Pacific community by 2020. What do we mean by that? And then some discussion about how you might get there out of existing architectural arrangements. I think one of the problems we face at present across the Asia-Pacific region is that we don't have a single body capable of deliberating on the region's future, shall I say, political security and economic challenges. And the habits of cooperation across these policy spaces don't just spontaneously combust if you're any student of history. You actually need some institutional underpinnings to enable all that to occur. Let me give your critical role in the history of APEC as a chairman, as I recall it, of the original Eminent Persons Group, commissioned, I think, by the Australian Prime Minister at the time, and I think his Japanese counterpart, to do that through the Gaima Show. Is APEC, and one of its great intended or semi-intended or perhaps unintended consequences, provided for the first time a regular annual forum where, for example, the heads of government of China and the United States could meet in a normal deliberative forum about a whole bunch of other stuff rather than bilateral summitry. Because bilateral summitry usually, and if you look at the history of summits, tends to have kind of winners and losers who came out on top and often are surrounded by an atmosphere of crisis. Not always, but often. Therefore, the great, I think, maybe intended consequence of APEC has been to create for the last 20 years this regular forum in which whoever the President of the United States is sits down with Chinese counterparts, other counterparts from elsewhere in the world, to chew the fat on what's going on. That's actually been very helpful. Now, going back to the proposal for an Asia-Pacific community, I think one of the things, for example, that we could be advantaged by is to have a forum wider than APEC in terms of its remit. As you know, APEC is an exclusively economic body, primarily focused on trade enhancement, trade facilitation, and trade liberalisation, and these are good things, and they should be encouraged. But if you can widen the remit to include political and security cooperation over time, I think that also helps build the culture and habits of cooperation. I'm always seized by the experience of Europe, which is it took them a long time in Europe to figure out by 1945 there must be a better way of doing things. And so began the deliberations of what became the European Union. I don't for the moment recommend a European Union model for the Asia-Pacific region. I think we just should be mindful of the fact that the habits of cooperation which came out of the emergence of what is now called the EU, which was for a time the EC and which began as the Treaty of Rome, was France, Germany and others, through that institution, evolved the habits of dialogue, cooperation, consultation around areas of matters of common challenge and concern. And I think creating the institutional mechanism to do that in the Asia-Pacific century for the decades ahead would be an important addition to our common prosperity and common security. Final point is, right now we have APEC, which has an exclusively economic remit, which includes America. We have ASEAN, ASEAN Plus 3, the East Asia Summit, which has a somewhat broader remit, but excludes the United States. I don't think that's a good way for the future. We want America fundamentally engaged with the emerging institutional architecture of the wider Asia-Pacific region, and I think that is all to the good. Our proposal is simply to focus the debate and the discussion on this deliberately with a long-term goal so that we can all think about how we can build the institutions of cooperation better than is currently the case.
Steve?
Steve Beckman, formerly with the United Automobile Workers Union. I have two quick questions, which I hope you'll be able to address also quickly, given the time. First, I wonder if you think that the global trade imbalances and the financial flows that resulted from those contributed to the global nature of the financial crisis that we've experienced, and what you think about that. Second, just recently, some new labor legislation was passed by the Parliament in Australia. I wonder if you think that this expansion of bargaining rights for workers, moving back from extremely constricting legislation that had been passed under previous prime ministers, whether this will contribute as a response, as a stimulus to the economy in Australia and allow for some additional growth, and whether more broadly you think that labor legislation and bargaining rights for workers contributes to economic stimulus that would be beneficial for the world economy.
Now, having to listen very carefully to your second question about industrial relations laws in Australia, your first question again was global imbalances. That's right. Sorry, I was busily taking some notes on the second. Well, the global imbalances question is about who's right and who's wrong in this debate, which is why all political leaders flee from participation in the discussion of it publicly. So let me try and do so gracefully. Look, it takes two to tango, and when you've got surplus economies running around the world who are with constraints for one reason or another in terms of domestic consumption, that's part of the reality. The other part of the reality is insufficiently regulated credit markets in, let's call them deficit economies. These are just two realities. I think we all just need to accept that that's a fact. In terms of redoing the future, obviously that's an element for the deliberation for the long term. And I think we all have a great interest in consumption levels and demand levels in emerging economies in particular increasing over time. That is a huge fuel for growth for the global economy long term as well. Which leads actually into an answer to the second point, obscurely, which is if I look, for example, at a country, let me just think of one for a moment, China, and look at some of the constraints on domestic consumption within that country. It's impeded often by the absence of effective, let's call it, social provisioning, whether that's a cocktail of labour laws or let's call it basic social insurance, social security and the rest. If working people in countries are not confident that they will have sufficient support in the event that they lose their jobs, obviously that's going to have a huge impact on people's preparedness to spend and consume. Therefore, a constraint on spending and consumption in economies like China, and I've said this elsewhere, there's nothing remarkable in what I'm saying, reinforces the problem of raising Chinese demand, which is of course important for global economic recovery now, but also in the long term as well.
Ken?
Ken Lieberthal, the Brookings Institution. Thank you for your very good remarks, Mr. Prime Minister. When you came into office, you repositioned Australia on the issue of global climate change. I wonder what your bottom line assessment is at this point in terms of the impact of the global financial crisis and national responses to that crisis on the possibility of getting a good agreement out of Copenhagen at the end of December, or more broadly, simply whether you think this is on balance going to pose a major setback to efforts to rein in carbon emissions going forward, or whether you see that effort proceeding reasonably well despite the economic crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And I just again use the opportunity to acknowledge your extraordinary contribution to China scholarship over a long period of time. As someone who's studied this a bit myself, you're right out there as someone that we read and pay a lot of attention to. On the question of climate change, does the global financial crisis make Copenhagen easier or harder? Let me think about that. It makes it harder. And that's just the truth of it. Let's just accept the reality. I think the other part of the reality is that climate change is both an economic and environmental challenge. Anyone who seeks to separate the matrix, I think, is not being intellectually honest about it. If you don't deal with climate change, in the medium to long term, that is in terms of measures coming into force, and the economic cost of adjustment, as many studies have indicated, is a real problem, and that applies to so many economies around the world. Therefore, the challenge of statecraft and diplomacy in the road to Copenhagen will be difficult, but by no means impossible. It's going to mean that on the question of calibrating everyone's national responses to climate change with their international commitments, that's going to require an enormous amount of work. What I'm encouraged by enormously in the United States is the fact that the United States of America is now in the game. And it's critical that that be the case. Because it makes it much harder for those who would choose to be outside the game in the developing economies to remain outside the game. And that is of fundamental importance to achieving a good global outcome on climate change. I don't have my crystal ball with me. I can't predict what would happen in Copenhagen. I am optimistic we can achieve some real progress on the road to Copenhagen and at Copenhagen. But to be real about it, the degrees of difficulty have got greater. But you know, climate change just doesn't go away. You can't just wish it away as some other policy variable. It's there, it's happening. The real impact for economies across the world over time should itself be the subject of rolling economic analysis in terms of the cost of inaction, because that should as much fuel the debate about appropriate global and national settings as the cost of action. And our argument all along has been that the economic cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of the economic cost of action.
Mr. Prime Minister, with your encyclopedic mastery of all these questions, I suspect we could keep you here for several more hours, but we've reached our witching hour. We do want to thank you enormously for your remarks. We wish you the best of success in London next week, back home in Australia, with your continued close ties with the United States. We wish you well, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.